This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Starting today's show is David Schemm, Executive Director of the Kansas Farm Service Agency, as he discusses how producers can serve on county committees and how counties are qualifying for the Livestock Forage Program. Terry Griffin, K-State Precision Agricultural Specialist, keeps the show rolling as he explains how language in agricultural publications has changed over the decades. Part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat Podcast with Brad White, Bob Larson, Scott Fritz, and Dustin Pendell concludes today's show as they chat about what decisions need made when making improvements on leased pasture ground. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show hearing from the Executive Director of the Kansas Farm Service Agency, David Schemm. David, thanks for joining us today.
Not a problem, Shelby. We're here in summer, and summer crops are out there growing. I've had the opportunity to kind of get across the state and seeing all stages of summer crops. I know some of the corn's tasseled out, and I saw some corn the other day that wasn't even knee-high, and I think I can honestly at this point say, Shelby, unfortunately, I think wheat harvest is, for some people, is still in the process of wrapping up, but in the middle of the summer.
David, as we are looking across the state, county committee nominations have opened up, and what are those for the state?
So our county committees, for those of the people that may not be familiar, they're a 3 to 5 member, depending upon the local area units that they cover or represent for each county. But 3 to 5 member committees that are elected by other producers within that county or within those areas to represent the producers at the FSA office there. Again, these people are a lot of times making determinations on enrollments and applications and everything like that. So definitely is a very, very big role, when they look at various appeals or relief cases they may have to see there. These are 3-year terms when they're elected, and when the area unit that comes up for election, it's terming out, have opportunity for people to be nominated or nominate themselves being willing to serve in those areas there. So that deadline is August 3rd here. So coming up real fast, Shelby. Get into the local office if you have questions on whether or not you could possibly be interested on nominating somebody or if you're willing to serve, but also make sure you're registered to be able to vote for those members there. So again, get into the local county office. That deadline is August 3rd.
What makes someone eligible to be nominated?
So basically, each of our counties are broken up into local area units, and basically these committee members are representing those regions of the county. And so those regions rotate, like I said, on a 3-year rotation there. So for a producer to qualify, they need to be located within the area that would be coming up for election that year. Again, all the producers within that county can vote on that committee on there, but to be actually being able to be nominated or run for that there, you need to be from that area unit. So you can represent that area of the county, essentially, Shelby.
And as you mentioned, those nominations closing August 3rd, however, a deadline that has passed, base acres that closed the 15th, and what's the next step for that?
So we had our acreage reporting due here July 15th, and I know our producers out there going through enrollment know that's an incredible busy time for our county offices out there. And so they were all getting producers that had reported those acres there. If a producer should have missed that deadline or if they are on a register, definitely make sure you're in touch with your county office that you can very quickly get that acreage report submitted there. But that acreage report, Shelby, for us, that gives us the foundation, lets us know what crops our producers out there planted and where they planted them at, grassland acres that they have and where they're located upon their operations. So many of our programs use that as a basis. But also, like you were kind of referencing, is those base acres, Shelby, there. That planted acres also goes into developing history. And recently with the base acre update, where passed underneath the Working Families Tax Cut Act, or some people refer to it as OBA as well, there was the 30 million additional base acres that Congress made available out here to states for producers there. So we've been working on that. And again, looking at that history between 2019 and 2023, what the producers, as reported in the acreage report, planted during those times there, and where they could possibly update the base acres on that, Shelby.
Another notable program with FSA, Grassland CRP, and what's the involvement you're seeing from Kansas producers?
So, grassland CRP, always what I like to say is there's the three components of CRP. We have kind of a continuous CRP. A lot of times those are longer term contracts with FSA up to like a 15-year. And a lot of times they're much more targeted towards, could be even possibly like smaller acreage, maybe a waterway or a part of a field, something like that. And so that's our continuous CRP. Our general CRP is, again, kind of like by definition, general CRP. It's the broad acre sign-up, typically running around a 10-year sign-up period there, and definitely can encompass those full fields out there for our producers. Of course, our third one, like you mentioned, is our grassland CRP. Now, it's a little bit newer program for us, but I kind of like to call it, Shelby, that working conservation program there. So producers can sign up their pastures or grass areas they have, still continue to graze there, but they can qualify for the grassland CRP, developing a grazing plan or a conservation practice that they want to have out there on that there and qualify for the grassland CRP. So, just for a little bit of reference there, we had quite a few acres that was submitted underneath grassland CRP for Kansas there. But the one cap that we do deal with is the 27 million acre cap that's put in place there by Congress there. So there's actually, from a nationwide perspective, there was only about 1.9 million acres available for CRP, for additional acres in CRP before they become capped out. Kansas they have a few expiring acres this year as well, but we had over 95,000 acres accepted into the grassland CRP. Wish it would have been 100%, but we just ran too close up to the cap there. We only had about an 80% acceptance level, which I still think is really good there. But yes, we came up and the administrator and their press release let us all know out there that essentially we hit the 27 million acre cap. They do generally keep just a few acres in reserve for slight deviations or fluctuations on that, but we're essentially at our 27 million acre cap. And that's why, as Kansas here, we only had that 80% acceptance level just because of hitting that acre cap.
And unfortunately, a program we can talk about for the Kansas Farm Service Agency, LFP, or Livestock Forage Program. And can you remind us what that does for producers?
Sure. Yeah, Livestock Forage Program, that's that unfortunate one that, and I say it that way, it is great to be able to assist our producers there, basically compensating them for lost forage production. What producers need to do is basically go in, talk to their county office there. It is based upon the drought monitor map, Shelby. So anytime a county hits a D3 drought designation on the drought monitor map, or if they've been in drought 2 or a D2 level for 4 weeks, that triggers the Livestock Forage Program for our livestock producers in those counties there. You can go into the local county office there, ask about signing up. Again, some of the key things that we need is basically some type of inventory showing how many animals you had out there on that. They do have some time to sign up. Obviously, we hope those drought levels, D3 or that D2 in 4 weeks, we hope they disappear. But the producers actually have clear until March of next year to report that there. The only thing I'm going to caution producers on that, I hope you have all your accurate records if you wait clear till March of next year to be able to, help us know how many livestock you had out in the pasture there. So it's always good to come in a little bit earlier so you can provide that inventory count for our local offices on that program.
And a lot of times when I think livestock for Kansas, I think of cattle, but does this qualify for other species as well?
No, absolutely it does, and that's why I kept it. I am just like you, Shelby. I kind of think of cattle when I talk about livestock, but no, this also qualifies for other species out there that utilize, again, it's a forage program. So in other words, it's when effectively we lose forage. So obviously any people out there that have possibly sheep, goats, any type of livestock that depends upon that livestock or upon that forage production there, they can also qualify for the Livestock Forage Program.
As you look ahead, David, what's on deck for the agency?
We're eagerly anticipating and hopeful, as I know many of our producers are as well, that we do have a new farm bill to implement here this year or later this year. The current one will expire here at the end of September there. So definitely looking forward to that. One of the things that the Secretary has said, and we have been fast working on, there's some last factors on the Working Families Tax Cut Act, or OBA as it's referenced there, that we're implementing there. In fact, just recently of Livestock Forage Program now qualifying for just 4 weeks of D2. That actually used to be 6 weeks underneath the old program, Shelby, but also the 30 million base acre update as well as part of OBA. So we're busy working on implementing that there, coming down. And of course, the big one with that is going to be that base acre update, as I kind of alluded to earlier there, that many of our producers or landowners right now should already have an email or possibly a postcard in the mail, basically saying that these are the acres that you're qualifying to add onto your base acres based upon that history production in 2019. So for those landowners out there that may have not received something yet, or do you have questions, absolutely go into that county office and have that discussion with them. So busy time there, implementing all those things there. And of course, never know what might else be coming through, but that's what Kansas FSA is about. We're, like our producers out there, adaptable and ready to meet any challenge.
David, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
That was Executive Director of the Kansas Farm Service Agency, David Schemm. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing how language has evolved in agricultural publications with K-State Precision Agricultural Specialist Terry Griffin. Terry, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, Shelby, it's great to be here. I'm excited to talk about something that's a little bit different from what we usually chat about, digital ag and space weather. This is, old school farm management today.
And while we're looking at farm management and how some of the wording or even how many authors are on these papers, what were you looking at for this research in-depth data look that you did?
In the last few years, because of AI and some other things, all of a sudden we had access to a archive of historic information. So in particular, this journal is on JSTOR, and it's freely available for everybody to look at, the almost 2,000 articles since 1937. And they're digitized. And so I was able to access nearly 2,000 papers of their titles and the authors and the number of authors and a lot of the metadata. And since it was available, I got excited and thought, hey, let's make some charts and look at some trends over time. I wasn't really looking for anything in particular other than, what's remained the same and what's changed over the last 90 years.
What have been some of the big points you saw change over these past 90 years?
The biggest one that has really flip-flopped is the number of authors on these papers. So up to 1960, 1970, one author, a sole author, was the most common. That was kind of the way papers were written. And in 1980 is when multiple authors and sole authors each held half of the papers. And so we've looked at the charts over time, and it's a mirror image. So in the last 30 years, multiple authors has been nearly 100% of all papers, while sole authors are roughly 10% of papers during the last 30 years. And that's completely flipped from the origins. From 1930 to 1970, it was 80-90% sole authored papers.
And from your look into this and also being in academics, is that because of the industry or because of the academic side of things?
I think both. So, complexity of interdisciplinary work is part of it. So it's not just a economist working on the project, or maybe one or two economists, an animal scientist, or a agronomist and an engineer. And I think a lot of it's more teamwork. And part of the teamwork, I do believe, comes from the way funding agencies require interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary projects. And some of the time, if you've ever applied for grants from the federal government, it's also a multi-institutional. So it's not just K-State specialists on a project. It may be K-State, Nebraska, University of Georgia, because of funding requirements, bring more people to the table. And I think that's part of this number of authors. And also, and anyone who's been around the halls of academia has heard the phrase publish or perish, which means, if you're a young academic, you are expected to publish. Otherwise, you perish in the field and you may have to go somewhere else. And so that's a big part of it also, which may, in economics, we had this concept. I'm not saying this is what happened, but we'll talk about it. In economics, we have this concept called the free rider problem, where we have gift authorship. Maybe if the third, fourth person added to the list may have very little to do with the actual study.
So while we're looking at all this, have there also been changes in the number of words in titles?
There have, So this particular journal does have a requirement, or at least they do today, of 10 or fewer words in the title. And, unfortunately, not everybody plays by the rules. We had some that were 16 words, 17 words. The most common, after we took out of the filler words, and we're just looking at actual words, 4 was the most common, followed by 5. And those things did change over time. For instance, from 1930 to 1970, the average number of words was 4. And then from 1980s through 2000, it reached 7. And we're going back down a little bit. Currently, last couple of years, we've been at 6 words in each title. And so we become wordier over time. And that might be, think about that. We don't write in the Shakespearean language, right? If you looked at some of those that get very wordy, but academics have become wordier over time. There's a phrase called type token ratio, and this is interpreted as complexity of the vocabulary. And it does increase over time as well. It's steadily increased, and we're at the highest point today. So there is some, I guess, academic benefit and reward for having complex titles and words in the titles.
And while we're on the topic of words, an interesting aspect that you also looked at is what the most common or frequent words were in different decades. And can you touch on what a few of them were?
Words like farm, they were very common across 90 years. But the word economic, for instance, was used sporadically up until the late 1970s. But through the 1980s and 1990s, it really took off. And it's kind of slowed down since then. But words like risk did not even show up until the late 1970s. Anyone in farm management will probably have heard of Michael Dolge. He's currently at Purdue. In 1977, he had sort of the seminal paper, and it really shows up here. Once he started talking about risk, other people followed, and that word didn't even show up until then. Words like tax was really hot in the late 1970s and through the 1980s farm crisis. The word American was used a lot up until the 1970s, so it sort of had that post-World War II patriotic, feel. Is one way I look at it. And there was some issues with during that time period. For instance, we did a sentiment analysis by looking at the words and if the words conveyed positive or negative connotations. And there was some negative World War II connotations, and there was some positive post-World War II feelings. And the same can be said about the late 1970s when there was the uncertainty around farmland values going really high, and then the crisis from the 1980, 1981 farm financial issues. And so those also showed up on sentiment with the number of words being used. One of the interesting things I thought is this journal that we wrote for is the Society Journal, and a lot of our listeners may be active members. It's the American Society of Farm Managers and Rural Appraisers. So you would expect those words in the title of the society to be very common, and they were: farm, farmland, agriculture. Rural was actually very common up through the 1970s. And since 1980s, especially in the 1990s, it's really slowed down and ramped off, not being used very often in title words.
Terry, earlier you made a mention of artificial intelligence, and do you predict or think that with the use of more of that AI, it will also change how this looks moving forward?
I do. My children are Generation Z, they're college age, and they know a lot more about AI than I do. But going through college classes, it seems like they have been threatened not to use it. They're not scared of it. They just feel like it's wrong and it's cheating. I've started using it in the last year, and in part, I mentioned that because of AI, we have access to this metadata for this particular journal. I also used AI to help me scrape the data from not only that journal, but some metadata from the number of citations, that was how many times that each of those papers were cited. And I use that in my analysis. I do the analysis, but I do lean on AI quite a bit. That being said, if we look at the history of this journal, 90 years, when it started, let's just say 1940, at that time, we had no idea that satellite signals would be helping us drive tractors through the field and make parallel passes. That would have been, well, we didn't even really have tractors being critical mass of farms in 1940. The words like the internet, satellite, automated guidance, digital were not even in the vernacular, or even in thought. Even our engineers in 1940 was not thinking about these things. Today, there's been papers that have focused on digital agriculture, artificial intelligence, how farmers use the internet. And so it will change. It will become part of the vernacular, part of the language that is used moving forward.
Terry, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Hey, Shelby, it's great. It's been a fun topic, and I'm continuing to look at this study. It is published, but I am going to write up another one about how some of these papers became enduring quality. Some of them started hot and remained hot with the number of citations over time. Some lay dormant for a decade or two before they started being picked up and cited. Called those the sleeping beauties. And third type is the opposite of that. They started off hot for a year or two, and then after about 5 or 10 years, they just kind of fizzled away. I call those flash in the pans. But the next time we talk about this study, I'll bring those to the table.
That was K-State Agricultural Precision Specialist Terry Griffin. I will link the publication with this article in it in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we wrap up our Wednesday show with part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat Podcast with Brad White, Scott Fritz, Dustin Pendell, and Bob Larson.
This is a scenario that happens. So a producer emailed and said, hey, there's a piece of crop ground that was very close to my house. I would like to rent it for pasture, but there's no fences, no water, currently no grass. If I make these long-term improvements to that piece of land, how do I work that in as a land lease or a pasture lease? And what is the potential arrangement that I set up? And I know, Scott, you've had some of your clients in the past when you were in practice did some of these leases. What's your initial take on that? And then we'll get Dustin's thoughts.
I guess before you get into specifics, it's all communication between the two parties. And then I think you need to have pretty clear language on what happens when the lease terms end, who gets to keep what. And then you got to worry about water sources and those kind of things too. But at service value, I think it's all communication.
Because some of those are big expenses. And if you put in water, a permanent water source, you're not pulling that out when you leave. So that was part of their question is long-term lease or short-term, or how do I structure that? And what you're saying is, however you do it, think about how you're going to spread out those expenses over the years. Dustin, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so a couple things. Growing up, I know we had at least one pasture. It was right next to an individual's house, but it was also lie along a creek. And I want to say, again, I was younger, so I don't know that I know all the details, but we bought a lot of the supplies, which again kind of goes against what you were saying, but that was part of the arrangement. Again, it comes back to the communication. Know exactly. But because we bought some of the fencing supplies and, Dad's labor was pretty cheap at the time.
That was you.
It was me and my brother and sisters. But we got that pasture for longer, and it may be even at a reduced price. Yes, communication is the key thing. Figure out what the arrangement is. On agmanager.info, again, I don't know where the listener was. I think it was the East Coast. But maybe if you take a look at your local land grant systems, we did a survey 2 years ago here at K-State in Ag Econ, and of all just fencing materials, with barbed wire, labor, all the different things. And so maybe before you jump into that, maybe you take a look and try to kind of come up with some cost estimates and figure out, what do I need to make a return on that, or whatever my rate of return I want, what do I need to set this price at, and then start communicating with your potential lease.
That's a point we didn't touch on too, is just stewardship of the land. How cow in date, cow out date, if those things need to be negotiated with some sort of buffer, weather dependent, those kind of things. And then even the cosmetic appearance of the fence can matter to some people. And so it's all just going to go back to having those discussions up front before anything gets done.
And if this is crop land, I'm assuming this is marginal cropland. You're not putting it. But if corn prices go back up to 4, 5, 6, 7 bushel, are you maybe pull this out of pasture going back into?
It still goes back to the communication. And my understanding of the listener's question was this was actually a new landowner. So this landowner bought this land from the previous owner. And so that's one of the reasons why they're shifting. They're shifting from crop production to possibly pasture production. But that really, again, people own land for lots of different reasons, to generate rent income, take advantage of that long-term appreciation, fairly safe investment, or maybe other reasons. And so a person that's grazing cattle on it needs to fully understand what the landowner wants. If you want a long-term lease, I need to meet their needs. And so it might be some cosmetic, it might be, soil restoration, it might be rental income. But I need to put my preferences aside if I want to have a long-term lease with them and meet their needs, and a lot of conversation. And I'm going to turn to Dustin here. I'll bet you want me to write it down and not just assume that we understand each other orally.
Yeah, you got to get everything in writing. I'm sure there are a lot of handshake agreements, but I don't know how. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know anything about that. I don't know how that would hold up in court. So getting everything
just misunderstandings.
Yeah.
I'm trying to avoid them by writing it down.
Yeah.
Once again, that was part of BCI's Cattle Chat Podcast. That's what we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.